Holy Ghost, here's your flash briefing. In weather. Right now in London, it's 12 degrees Celsius with showers. Throughout the day, you can expect more of the same, with a high of 15 degrees and a low of 14 degrees. From BBC World Service.
BBC News. Hello, I'm Tom Watt. Environment ministers are in the Italian city of Milan for a final round of talks before the key climate conference, COP26, in Scotland in November. There's already been stern criticism from the climate activist Greta Thunberg, who said efforts by politicians amounted to 30 years of blah, blah, blah. Here's our environment correspondent, Matt McGrath.
Earlier this week, Greta Thunberg lambasted the efforts of political leaders to tackle climate change as so much hot air, pointing out that 50% of carbon dioxide emissions had occurred since 1990. She was one of 400 young people who came to Milan to formulate proposals on how to tackle rising temperatures that will be presented to ministers here today. Despite Ms. Thunberg's criticism about the pace of progress, UN officials believe the wheels are beginning to turn on a number of key issues. New commitments on coal by China and cash by the US have given impetus to hopes of landing a deal when world leaders meet in Glasgow in November.
North Korea's leader Kim Jong-un has spurned a US offer of talks as a show to cover up what he called America's hostile act. However, Mr. Kim offered to restore a vital communication hotline with South Korea as early as next week as a first step towards reconciliation. The singer Britney Spears has won a bitter legal battle to wrest control of her finances back from her father. A judge in Los Angeles has removed Jamie Spears from her conservatorship. He was appointed in 2008 because of concerns over his daughter's mental health. From Los Angeles, Sophie Long reports.
During a court hearing which focused on the extent to which Jamie Spears had controlled his daughter, Britney Spears' lawyer said the last 10 years of her life had been a Kafkaesque nightmare, and that allegations her father had bugged her home warranted serious investigation. Matthew Rosengart also accused Mr. Spears of mishandling his daughter's $60 million estate. Mr. Spears' lawyer denied the allegations and said his record had been impeccable. But Judge Brenda Penny said the current situation was untenable and reflected a toxic environment that required Jamie Spears to be suspended with immediate effect.
The president of Ecuador, Guillermo Lasso, has confirmed that 116 inmates are now known to have died in Tuesday's prison riot in the port city of Guayaquil. Several of the victims were decapitated in what's become the country's most deadly prison uprising ever. Guns, rifles and hand grenades were used during the fighting. 2 Palestinians have been shot dead by Israeli forces in separate incidents. In the first, in the Old City, police said a woman took out a knife, causing police officers to open fire. In the second incident, Israeli soldiers shot dead a man near the West Bank town of Jenin. World News from the BBC. The jailed Belarusian opposition activist Maria Kolesnikova has told the BBC she has no regrets about resisting an attempt to deport her by force last year, even though she ended up in prison for her protests against President Lukashenko. Here's Sarah Rainsford.
When the Belarusian authorities tried to force Maria Kolesnikova into exile, the opposition activist ripped up her passport and ended up in prison instead. Writing from her cell, where she's now beginning an 11-year sentence, Maria Kolesnikova told me she had realised the risk of her act of defiance, but she doesn't regret it, and she'd even do the same again. She said she preferred to be living through this tough time, as she called it, alongside the Belarusian people. A classical musician, Maria Kolesnikova became a key figure in last year's protests against a presidential election that many believe was rigged to keep the authoritarian Alexander Lukashenko in power.
The British government's pandemic furlough scheme comes to an end today. It gave workers unprecedented financial support for 18 months. Faisal Islam reports.
The coronavirus job retention scheme has succeeded in keeping the official unemployment numbers at less than half the level predicted at the start of the pandemic. But there is now some uncertainty over the fate of the million or so workers still having their wages subsidised. But the Chancellor Rishi Sunak will argue today that other forms of support are being maintained and that the recent surge in job vacancies and worker shortages shows that now is the right time to close it.
And a cafe table where J.K. Rowling wrote parts of her Harry Potter books in the Scottish capital, Edinburgh, has been saved after a fire badly damaged the building it was in. The owner of the Elephant House Cafe says he was immensely relieved to find the wooden antique in the rubble. He says it can be restored despite water and smoke damage. BBC News.
From BBC News.
This is BBC News, the headlines. A judge in Los Angeles has removed Britney Spears' father from the legal arrangement that gave him control of her finances after the American pop star accused him of years of abuse. The judge said it was in the singer's best interest that the legal arrangement should end. Over 100 prisoners and guards have been killed in Ecuador's deadliest ever prison riot. The police say the violence in the port city of Guayaquil is the result of a dispute between local gangs affiliated to two powerful Mexican drug trafficking organizations. The police officer who raped and murdered the British woman Sarah Everard is facing a full life sentence. A court in London was given details of how Wayne Couzens kidnapped Ms Everard in March using handcuffs and an ID card to falsely arrest her. Those are the headlines.
From Sky News.
Good afternoon, all that to come, but first, the Transport Secretary has insisted the government is seeing the first signs of stabilisation in the UK's fuel supply. This comes as the Army has been put on standby to help deal with the crisis, which has seen petrol stations run dry across the country. It was all sparked by a shortage of fuel lorry drivers and made worse by days of panic buying by motorists. Let's get an update on the current situation. Our correspondent Charlotte Lomas is here and been looking at things up and down the country and the various parties involved, their latest responses. What can you tell us, Charlotte?
Well, the situation is improving, but we're still seeing queues across the country and some petrol stations remain closed. The Transport Secretary, Grant Shapps, says the situation is beginning to stabilise. And he says the Army are familiarising themselves with fuel distribution in the event they're needed to step in.
Well, we've certainly brought in a lot of different measures. The Army coming in to familiarise themselves with the distribution is the 18th separate measure we've taken. And of course, a lot of petrol's now being transferred into people's cars. And there are now the first very tentative signs of stabilisation in the forecourt storage, which won't be reflected in the queues as yet. But it's the first time we've seen more petrol in the petrol stations itself. I think, as the industry said yesterday, the sooner we can all return to our normal buying habits, the sooner the situation will return to normal.
Let's take a look now at some of the latest figures that we have for you. BP has said as of last night about a third of its stations, that's around 400, were out of fuel. And the Environment Secretary, George Eustace, told Sky News that as of yesterday, demand was 20% higher than average. That's down from about 50% higher on Saturday. And in the last hour, the Petrol Retailers Association said there is still a problem.
The extreme demand levels witnessed over the weekend have eased somewhat. There are still demand levels well above the norm. As a result, many of our members have sites dry, and many of the big groups are down to about 50% of their sites being dry. So there is still a problem out there. There is still a bit of panic buying. There's still queuing. But we are hopeful that we are seeing the first signs of a move towards equilibrium later in the week.
Well, we can show you now some of those queues here at petrol stations around the country. This one here was a scene at one forecourt in Bedford this afternoon. But we have seen tankers leaving the Kingsbury oil terminal in Tamworth in the West Midlands, so petrol is on its way to some of the forecourts. Meanwhile, the government's confirmed that the military has been put on standby to help with the supply shortage if needed. Up to 150 military tanker drivers are being trained to deliver to forecourts in case they need to be deployed. So how is this crisis impacting critical frontline workers? Well, there are growing calls from unions and professional bodies for key workers to be allowed priority access to fuel supplies. The teaching union, the NASUWT, says its members should be included to minimise disruption to schools. And the British Medical Association told Sky News a little earlier that essential services could be hit if staff are unable to work.
Like many others, if I need fuel, then I can't be waiting 2 or 3 hours because I've got patients who are very unwell to see, and many other colleagues who work in the community will feel the same way. And as I said, we've had no information at all. Nothing has been told to us by the senior managers, by the politicians, to the health and social care workers, and that's just not right. We want to get on with our job. But we can't do that if we haven't got the transport to do it. And as I say, so much work goes on in the community to help our patients that we need action immediately. We need urgent action today from the government. Now, they designate a local fuel station for priority critical workers. That's one solution, but we've heard nothing at all. And I hope the government act today on this.
In the meantime, a number of local councils are looking to take matters into their own hands to allow key workers priority access to the pumps. Surrey Council saying that social workers may be given a card which enables them to access those supplies. So what are the fuel companies telling us? 10 companies, including BP and Shell, have said in a statement that as many cars are now holding more fuel than usual, we expect that demand will return to its normal levels in the coming days. That's easing pressures on fuel station forecourts. We've also been hearing from the RAC, who say since Friday, we've seen a sharp increase in the number of our members who've been broken down as a result of running out of fuel. On Monday alone, we attended twice as many drivers in a single day for this problem than we would normally see over a whole week.
Thank you, Charlotte. Let's speak to Sky's Lisa Dowd. She's in the West Midlands today, where tempers have been fraying in lengthy queues there.
Frustration and anger, actually. Frustration directed against the man who runs this petrol station behind me, but also against other motorists as well. A lot of talk about panic buying, but when you ask people why they are getting fuel, they all appear to have a valid reason. Now, this morning there were queues at this petrol station. People were being limited to £35 of fuel per person. They have since run out, but they are hoping for a delivery later on today. One man I heard of had travelled 20 miles or so to come here and fill up. I spoke to Andrew Kilpatrick, who travelled 10 miles or so. He said all of the petrol stations around him were running dry, so he had travelled here and spent £15. He'd limited himself to that, and this is what he told me.
Because of the situation, I'm lucky to have a hybrid car, so I can get by with the charge, but I only get so many miles out of that. I thought I'd put some fuel in just as a backup. And I'm putting the bare minimum in because ultimately I don't want to take it away from like services that need it, like ambulances, taxi drivers, people that rely on their vehicles in order to survive and make a living.
Irritation and upset here, but elsewhere tensions really have flared in an isolated incident in southeast London, which we can show you footage of at Welling, where we see a man has been challenging another motorist. He appears to be holding a knife within the fuel queue. Now, we know from the Metropolitan Police that they came out to this incident. They found neither motorist, but they are now reviewing this footage of this incident, which happened yesterday afternoon. Back here, people are still turning up for fuel, still being turned around, and still frustrated that they can't get the petrol or diesel that they say they need.
Lisa Dowd reporting there from the West Midlands. So just how damaging is this crisis for the government? We can head to Westminster, where our Deputy Political Editor Sam Coates has been keeping across things, and the Transport Secretary sounding optimistic today, Sam. But this is part of a bigger problem, isn't it?
That's right. How damaging is it? Well, we're just going to have to wait and see how the next few days go, because the government has been arguing that essentially the fuel scare, the crisis, was caused by the leak of information last week that some forecourts were running a little bit low on fuel, on petrol, and that meant everyone rushed to the forecourts to fill up their cars, and that as time progresses, as the situation eases, that panic buying is going to go away. And there is some data, as you say, that things are not as bad as they were at the weekend. And also you just have the fact that people will have filled up and won't need to do so again, a fact that that ministers are pointing to. But the problem that the government has is that there are longer term issues that are also contributing to this. The reason that there was a shortage in the first place was because of the lack of lorry drivers. Yes, the government has taken steps. Grant Shapps points out that there are 18 steps. The last one that they took last night was to announce that they were putting army drivers on standby. But they don't want to use those, because anything that they do like that, or start to limit who can use petrol stations just to key workers, will signal that there is a big problem still, and people will continue to panic buy, and that will drain the reserves once again. So the government is really walking a careful tightrope, not wanting to sound too alarmist, making sure that they reflect all of the more positive news, and hope that essentially the public calming down is the best way to deal with this, with all eyes on Boris Johnson to see whether he sends out a message to the country to calm down.
In BBC Radio 4 from TuneIn.
BBC Sounds. Music, radio, podcasts.
Hello, welcome to Best of Today. I'm Nick Robinson in Brighton for the Labour Party conference. Stronger future together. Those are the words on the conference stage here, and they will frame the speech that Keir Starmer delivers. After a year in which he struggled to make an impression, after a week in which his party's divisions have been laid bare for all to see, after a conference in which others have dominated the headlines, he's got quite a challenge to make that slogan seem credible and to make himself look like Britain's next Prime Minister.
The most important pledge I made was that I would turn our Labour Party into a party that would be fit for government, capable of winning a general election. I'm not going to be deflected from that.
The whole of Keir Starmer's life has been preparation for the moment he takes to this stage, presents himself to the country as the man who could, who should be their next Prime Minister. Few here in Brighton at the Labour Party conference doubt that the former Director of Public Prosecutions is equipped for the job. Few here, though, do not harbour doubts about whether he has the charisma to get it.
Angela needs very little introduction, I think, but I'm very, very proud to call her a friend. She's been doing
charisma that others have displayed in bucketfuls.
I'm going to start with an apology. It's not what you think. Hear me out.
Blunt, plain speaking, comfortable in her own skin. Even when she is caught on camera attacking Tory scum, late at night, after Whisper Who Dares, perhaps the odd drink or two, Angela Rayner reaches the parts that her leader simply cannot reach. She spent the week sending smoke signals to her party, suggesting that she thinks that he has got to get his act together.
He's got to show the Keir that I see when he's relaxing and he's chilled out, and he's got to show the emotion that I think he brings to the job, as well as showing what I think is a very stable, secure plan of how we can rebuild Britain and make sure that it's inclusive, so everybody has decent wages, decent homes, and that people can get by and get on.
So have you given him an injection of the Rayner passion?
I have. I think he knows that, yeah. I've given him definitely some fire, and I'm sure you'll see that spirit and that fire tomorrow.
Rayner is not just Starmer's deputy. For many at this conference, she's the queen in waiting. How many fringes have you done now?
A few.
Are we up to a dozen Burnhams? Others look to the man who relishes his unofficial title, the King of the North.
The car is king in the north of England, not me. The car dominates everything.
No, not true.
Andy Burnham was not given the opportunity to speak from the conference stage, but he's been hard to avoid off it. His easy eloquence, his on-tap passion, even his tireless, suitless wardrobe are all a striking, and many believe a calculated contrast with his oh-so-buttoned-up party leader. And it's not just charisma that separates the two men. Every day, in every way possible, without, of course, risking open disloyalty, Burnham has sought to distance himself from Starmer.
I'm just nudging the party to put more on the table. I just think we live in a day and age now where politics has become more instant. If you go out there and criticise, as oppositions have to do when governments put policies on the table, what comes back immediately is, OK, what would you do then? And if you can't answer that question, they won't accept the criticism from you.
You